future-gazing publication, The World Ahead by The Economist, has brought together experts from around the world to reveal what lies ahead in more than 90 countries and in 24 languages to an international audience of more than 2.8 million people. During this era that feels unpredictable and unprecedented, their insights are essential reading for individuals, professionals, and policymakers alike. The Council has had a long-standing relationship with The Economist, where we have been able to bring expert-level analysis of existential issues straight to you. We are thrilled to bring the program back today for an especially interesting look into the new year, following one of so much uncertainty and change. What truly lies ahead in 2024? Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Liz Brailsford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Our program today features Tom Standage, Deputy Editor of The Economist, in conversation with our Council's President Emeritus, Jim Falk. If you haven't yet, I highly recommend that you subscribe to The Economist and keep up to date with the world ahead. I'd like to thank Global Santa Fe for partnering with us on this webinar. We appreciate the ability to be able to work together virtually. And then also I'd like to thank our promotional partners, our umbrella organization in Washington, D.C., the World Affairs Councils of America, and also the Phoenix Committee on International Relations. Finally, special thanks to our institutional partners, AT&T, Dallas Baptist University, Dallas College, Harwood International, Haynes and Boone, Lockheed Martin, NEC Corporation of America, PNC Bank, and Sidley Austin. And if you're not a member of the Council yet, please join our engaged citizens. You can check out all of our membership options and events on our brand new website at dfwworld.org. And lastly, I just want to say it is time for our annual fund. It's that time of year, and this year's theme is From Division to Dialogues, Supporting Civil Discourse. We provide a forum here at the Council that goes beyond misinformation, disinformation, clears that up, goes beyond the headlines, and we provide that unbiased platform. We want you to come and engage with that. Help us continue to do that. So please check out our website for the annual fund, and we'd love your support. Thank you very much. And last, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today's program. Like I mentioned, Jim Falk. He is the President Emeritus of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, and he retired in March of 2021 after serving as president since 2001. Now residing in Santa Fe, he is a member of the board of Global Santa Fe, where he chairs the program committee. And with that, I will hand it over to my friend, Jim. Jim, thank you so much for being with us, and Tom, you as well. Happy holidays to all.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's great to always have the chance to work with the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, of course. And I think, Tom, this is the fifth year that we've done this, and really appreciate you taking time to talk with members from across the country about the world ahead. As Liz mentioned, Tom is the deputy editor of The Economist and editor of The Year Ahead, and he studied engineering and computing at Oxford University. He joined what they call the newspaper in 1998 as its science correspondent. Later positions included technology editor, business editor, and digital editor, and is the author of 7 history books, including one of my favorites, which is somewhere back here, History of the World in 6 Glasses. He wrote that in 2005, and to give you a bit of the spirit of the book, pun intended, he wrote, "Rum was the liquid embodiment of both the triumph and the oppression of the first era of globalization." And lastly, but very important, he's also known at The Economist as the drummer on the Economist band. Thanks, Tom.
Great to be here again. Thanks for inviting me.
So I think what we'll do is sort of set the stage, because I think people always find it interesting about how you go about publishing The World Ahead. Then we'll turn it over to you for your great presentation on trends, et cetera, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So this seems like such a hard project, especially as we were talking about it through email a few weeks ago. There always seems to be a major event happening in October, which strikes me as that would be when you're getting ready to publish the special edition.
Yes, we actually start the process in May, and we sort of, at that point, we can see some of the things that are coming in the following year. But a lot of what we write down is sort of placeholders or just guessing. And then as we get closer to September, which is when I start expecting people to deliver articles, some of them write the article they expected, and others say, well, actually, the thing we really need to write about is whatever. So copy starts coming in September, and then essentially we have to assemble a kind of plausible first draft of it by about the middle of October. And then after that, we are just essentially running to stand still, updating it until it goes to press. And sometimes we predict things and they literally happen during October, and then we can't run that piece because we were expecting it, the following year. So yes, it is a weird process. It does take quite a long time. This is an interesting year, 2024, because there are certain things you can usually predict in advance. There are certain categories of things that are most easily predictable in advance. Elections, because they very often have a very predictable timetable, obviously in the US, but in other countries too. Anything that's happening in space, the laws of celestial mechanics are extremely predictable. So eclipses, when space probes will get to certain planets, those sorts of things. As long as the space probe has got off the ground successfully, you can be pretty sure. So that's a good one. And then big sporting events, and of course in 2024 we've got the Olympics. So there are sort of on diary stories, as we journalists call them, that you can see coming. But of course the big unpredictable stories are the big political and conflict and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, some bits of it are easier to predict and put together than others.
So one of the distinguishing characteristics of The Economist is the byline is not there in the weekly edition, but we do get to see some of the personality of the folks in the annual.
Yes, it's the same group of people from the weekly who are writing it, but historically the annual has always had bylines. This is a bit of a historical anomaly. I think it's because when the annual was launched about 38 years ago, I think it was, it mostly wasn't written by the journalists from the weekly. There were a few of them involved, but it was actually all sorts of other people and external guests. And the World Ahead has continued to have a tradition of external guests writing for us, and we've got some very distinguished guests this year, as we have had in previous years. So yes, it is a slight pulling back of the curtain, and you get to see who some of those authors are. But to be fair, I mean, our anonymity has frayed around the edges quite a bit in the digital era. When we do things like podcasting and videos, you can see who we are. You can see who we are on social media and so on. I think the main the weekly newspaper itself will always be anonymous. I think there's a couple of very rare exceptions where you get a byline in there. Essentially, if you write a special report in the middle of the paper, then traditionally you get a byline there. And by tradition, the editor, when retiring, writes a valedictory editorial where that's also bylined as the editor signs off. But those are very, very that only happens about every decade, so that's quite rare. So yes, I think although you can look at the sort of trajectory and say, well, you seem to be less anonymous than you were. I think that's true, but I think that the core anonymity of the core weekly product is sacrosanct and will remain.
So take us backstage, because one of the things that I enjoy so much is the guest columnists that you invite to appear in this issue. And there's this one by invitation, 5 Cold War Lessons by Niall Ferguson and Secretary Condoleezza Rice. How did that come about?
Well, actually, they'd written a piece for us. So we have a slot on our website called By Invitation, and they had written a version of this piece for that. And I wanted something on the new Cold War. And I basically said, can we run that in print? Or run it in. I mean, we have a print version, but it also runs as part of the World Ahead. So that was one where they'd actually already done that piece for our website, and we sort of took it into the annual. Others were pieces where we invited the writers in question. So we have Dr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, the Secretary of State, as you would say, I think, of India, giving us his view on India's place in this much more multipolar world that we see now. And he has said some quite pointed things in the past couple of years about Western hypocrisy and this sort of thing. I was expecting him to be a bit spikier actually in that piece. Instead, he talked about the accomplishments of India and sort of India's growing influence, which is all absolutely undeniable. But there's a couple of swipes at the unfairness of globalization and ensuring that that the views of more than just the usual Western powers are taken into account. But it was great. We very much wanted and he's a very good representative of the voice of the global South.
Sure.
Sort of saying, hang on a sec, our views should be given greater emphasis than they're currently getting in many forums, places like the G7 and so on.
Well, even foreign ministers sometimes have to play it safe. My last question before I turn it over to you is, Tom, I could tell you I was a little disappointed when I first started reading this, because some of the sections that I was accustomed to seeing and keeping on my desk over the year were not there. And then I realized that this was included in a weekly edition, and I need to go to the airport, as you might say, to go pick up the standalone.
version.
Tell us
Yes.
about how you made that
So-
decision
Yeah,
and what
so
can we as subscribers do?
Yeah, so we are distributing the print version of The World Ahead slightly differently this year. So what American subscribers have been used to is that they would receive the World Ahead usually sometime in December as the sort of 52nd copy of the year, because we do a double issue in over Christmas. And we also started sending print copies to subscribers in other countries too, in Britain, for example. And we decided that it would be more efficient to include the World Ahead into the weekly in the middle of November for print subscribers everywhere in the world, rather than just giving some subscribers in some countries this extra benefit. So the good thing about it is that more people get, anyone who gets a print edition of The Economist gets the World Ahead inside it. They also get it earlier. They get it the week before Thanksgiving, which gives them some more time to read it instead of getting it sometime in December. The drawback, if you are one of the people who used to get a standalone edition, is you don't get the standalone edition. And because the World Ahead is bound into the weekly, there's a limit to how many pages we could include. Because the staples inside the weekly, I mean, this is the thickest copy of The Economist since October 2000, the height of the dot-com boom, when we had a massive amount of advertising from dot-com firms. There's basically a hard limit of 196 pages on the size of The Economist, and that meant there was a hard limit of 90 pages on the size of the World Ahead supplement of editorial pages. So the bits we didn't include are the countries and the industries pages, and those are the sort of reference pages in the middle, 15 pages there. And they are available in the standalone edition. The industries stuff is available on our app and online, but the countries, the countries pages, we haven't found a good way of presenting that in digital form. So basically anyone who asks, I'll send them a PDF of that. But if you do want that reference version of the World Ahead with those extra pages in the middle, then yes, it is available on newsstands and at airports.
Okay, you've sold me.
So you've got so basically you've got some winners and some losers. So I
right.
like to think that we've got more winners than losers, but I feel your pain, and I'll happily send you a PDF of the bits that aren't there in that bound-in version.
Let's turn it over to you to hear your presentation.
Okay, cool. Thanks very much. Okay, well, yes, I've been editing The World Ahead this is the 4th year I've been the editor, and previously I was the deputy editor for a while. And you can see some of the, I hope you can see, yes, you can see some of the past covers that we've had here. And as we've mentioned, this is written by the journalists of The Economist, assisted by our colleagues at the EIU, which is the B2B arm of The Economist that does the countries and the industries forecasts, and also our guest writers, and also the super forecasters at Good Judgment, who are the world's best geopolitical forecasters, and they've done a handful of forecasts for us too. So I put all of that together, and I write an editor's letter that appears at the front, and that essentially tries to find the common themes that run all the way through the edition and pull out the 10 biggest points. So I'm essentially going to give you the live version of that letter right now. And let's jump in with number 1. 2020 is an unusual year because I said that elections are predictable. we could see that not only were we going to have a lot of elections in 2024, we could see that it was going to be potentially the biggest year for elections in history. So we went and did all the number crunching, and we spent months doing this, figuring out how many elections were happening, what population they are. And we realized that 2024 is the first year in human history where more than half of humanity will be living in a country that is holding a national election during the year. This has never happened before. If you add up all the elections, it's about 75, we think. And you add up the population of all those countries, you get to 4.2 billion. And the population of the Earth is about 8.1 billion. So it's more than half. And we think this will put a spotlight on the state of global democracy, because although that's a lot of democracy, it's a lot of voting, that's not the same as a lot of democracy. There's more to democracy than voting. And it's a lot of quantity of elections, but the quality is slightly different. So at the Economist Intelligence Unit, they run something called the Democracy Index. And essentially they give every democracy in the world a score out of 10, and they rank it on various things. And a full democracy, which scores more than 8, you can see on the right-hand side of this chart, Britain is an example of that. Germany is an example of that. Germany hasn't got. Germany's having the EU elections next year, so the EU is electing a new European Parliament. So that's why Germany has a national election next year. In Britain, we're going to have a general election. We'll probably get a different government, a different prime minister. Anyway, you can see they are the darkest colours on the far right there. The US and India count as flawed democracies because they score less than 8. They score between 7 and 8. And there are various things that flawed democracies lose marks on. India loses marks because its press isn't terribly free, and the opposition is getting legal harassment and that sort of thing. The US loses marks because essentially a lot of trust is lost in democracy. A lot of the sort of basic democratic mechanisms seem not to be working. There's sort of constant gridlock in Congress, and repeated concerns that the government's not going to pass a budget and agree to pay its bills, and these sort of crises seem to be happening more and more often. But if you look here on this chart, you can see that the biggest blobs are India, the United States, and Indonesia, which are the first, second, and third biggest democracies in the world, all of which have elections next year. And you can see Indonesia is also a flawed democracy. And then as you go down towards the left-hand side of the chart, you can see places that essentially have sham democracies. Places like Russia. Russia is going to have a presidential election next year. And I can tell you already who's going to win. It's going to be Vladimir Putin. And what's supposed to be happening with democracy is, democracy is supposed to be a process whereby the voters can choose their leaders, and they can get rid of their leaders if they don't like them. And that's not an option in Russia. The election will be rigged, and there will not be a real choice. Whereas at the other end of the scale, in Britain, we will actually probably chuck out the government that we've got now. So there's a lot of voting, but that's not the same as a lot of democracy. And I think the elections that people are going to be looking at most closely next year, there's two, one at the beginning of the year and one at the end. The first one at the beginning of the year is in Taiwan, and the election in Taiwan will really sort of set the tone for relations with China. The choice will be between William Lai, a much more sort of independence-leaning candidate, and then two much more China-friendly candidates. At the moment, it looks like William Lai will probably win, but we'll see, and that will really set the tone for relations across the Taiwan Strait, but also between the US and China as well. But the other election, of course, that everybody will be watching very closely next year will be the US election. Voters and the courts will give their verdict on Donald Trump. And we think he has a 1 in 3, probably slightly better than 1 in 3 chance of winning. If the election was held tomorrow, he would probably win. And this is going to be, like US elections tend to be now, a very close run thing. Very often they're a coin toss. It really could go either way. In the last election in 2020, it was really 40,000 votes in a handful of swing states. If they'd been in the other column, the outcome would have been different. So it's going to be very, very close, whatever happens. And it's going to come down to, as I say, a handful of swing states. But the consequences are going to be global, because if Donald Trump comes back, that will have all sorts of impact on the fight against climate change, on support for Ukraine, on what happens with immigration. He's talking about, you know, deporting millions of people, and that, you know, even if he tries to do that and doesn't succeed, but even tries, that will be a green light to people who want to pursue similar policies around the world. So really, the impact would be absolutely enormous, and there's a big sort of shadow cast over 2024 because obviously a Trump victory, he wouldn't be inaugurated until early 25. So it's really outside the scope of what's happening next year, which is what we're trying to think of. But it really is inescapable. I mean, you know, time and time again, one of the things that comes up in it doesn't matter what you're writing about, if you're writing about US-China relations or Ukraine or immigration or whatever, then the sort of, but you know, but all bets are off if Trump comes back, is the sort of recurring motif. The immediate focus right now, and I think at the going into 2024, is what all this means for Ukraine. So Republicans seem to be unwilling to support any more aid to Ukraine, and that means Europe is going to have to step up. If you look at the cumulative military and financial aid to Ukraine so far, and you add up the contribution from the EU countries and Britain, Norway, and Switzerland, that now exceeds the contributions from the US. So in some ways, Europe has stepped up already. However, the military aid has come at the expense of Europe running down its own stockpiles of weapons. And the financial aid is there, but it's not really on its own. It's not enough to plug the gap, the hole in Ukraine's economy as a result of the war it's fighting. So the EU really does need to signal, the European powers generally need to signal that they are prepared to back Ukraine for a long period, and that they are in this for the long haul. It's very clear that Vladimir Putin is in this for the long haul. He's now got something like 6 or 7% of Russian GDP going into the war effort. And if you look at things like artillery shell production, Russia is now producing more artillery shells than the whole of NATO put together. So NATO generally, but Europe in particular, needs an industrial mobilization to step up and support Ukraine. And this is the right thing to do, going back to the point about democracies. Those of us that live in full democracies, like I do in Britain and like most of the EU countries, Hungary does not count as a full democracy, it counts as a flawed democracy. But those of us who live in full democracy should not take it for granted. Just because there hasn't been a World War II style war in Europe for a long time doesn't mean it's not possible. And so we need to step up and defend democracy when it comes under threat. And I think America should be doing it too. I don't understand the logic of the Republican objections to this. This is, if you just look at this from a sort of completely mercenary accounting point of view, this is an amazing deal for America, because the aid to Ukraine, a lot of it goes to American arms manufacturers to make more weapons to send to Ukraine. And even when it doesn't, this is a way for the US to essentially attrit one of its leading geopolitical rivals without having to put any American troops on the ground. So this is a great deal, and America should be helping Ukraine as well. But if it's not going to, then Europe needs to step up. The other conflict, of course, that's very much on everyone's minds at the moment is what's happening in Gaza. Hamas's attack in October and Israel's subsequent retaliation against Gaza have upended the region and destroyed the idea that the Palestinians' plight could be ignored. So since 2020, we had the Abraham Accords, and we had several Arab states normalizing relations with Israel, primarily for economic reasons, but also to provide a counter to a common enemy of Iran. And it looks as though one of the main aims of the Hamas attacks for both Hamas and for Iran was to derail that Abraham Accords process, particularly because Saudi Arabia looked like it was interested in coming on board. So we'll see whether that has succeeded in 2024. We'll see what happens to that process. But I think the other big question for 2024 is what happens when the Israeli offensive ends, because there's a good chance that this will lead to new leadership both in Gaza but also in Israel itself. And paradoxically, that could reopen the door to the getting the peace process restarted. Ursula von der Leyen said, the president of the EU said last week, the probability of a two-state solution is higher than it has been in years. Now that's the bar is very low there, because the two-state solution has been assumed to be dead for many years. But people are talking about the Palestinians' plight, and they're talking about restarting the peace process in ways that they haven't done for a very long time. And American support for Israel does seem to be contingent on getting those wheels turning again. So paradoxically, the terrible violence that we're seeing now could open up a very, very narrow path to a long-term solution. But it's not just conflict in Ukraine and in Gaza. There's conflict flaring up all over the place. Across the Sahel, for example, you can now walk from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, a distance of about 6,000 kilometers, just passing through African countries that have had a coup since 2020. And there are increasingly zones of impunity around the world, in parts of the Middle East, in failed states where Iran's proxies are thriving. If you look in the Caucasus, in Russia's backyard, we just had this brief war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and Russia seemed powerless to defend Armenia, supposedly its ally. So there are many parts of the world really where major powers and global institutions seem to have no influence at all. And essentially, we're looking at a much more disordered world and a much more multipolar world. America's unipolar moment since the fall of the Soviet Union, where it was the only superpower, has definitively come to an end, and we have an awful lot more large powers coming to the fore, and a much more multipolar world as an example, as a consequence. And so America has gone from being the only superpower to being the overstretched superpower. And of course, what everyone's worried about particularly is that might China think, well, now might be a good time to make a move on Taiwan because America is distracted. And there is a theory called the window of vulnerability theory among China watchers that if China is going to do this, the late 2020s might be the best time to do it, because America's investment in beefing up its military presence in the Indo-Pacific will really only bear fruit in the 2030s. And so now might be good to make a move sooner rather than later. However, I don't think that's going to happen in 2024. But it is a reminder that wars can be cold as well as hot. And we are now looking at a Cold War between China and American-led Western Bloc. And this Cold War framing was something that we were very reluctant to embrace at The Economist, just because it's very different from the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union. In that original Cold War, there wasn't any trade to speak of, no economic linkage really between the two sides. And that's not the case at all with China. There is obviously an enormous amount of economic linkage in both directions. And China is an important end market for some Western companies, like Apple, for example, but it's also an extremely important manufacturing hub, again, for Apple. And so that means that it's it's an odd setup. It's very, very different, because the two sides in this Cold War are geopolitical rivals, but they're economically actually very tightly bound together. And so what we've seen is that technology has emerged as a central front in this new Cold War, and we've seen America putting restrictions on China's access to advanced technologies, particularly in chip making and the kind of chips that you need to train big AI systems. And we're going to see more tension over that in the coming year. And the other thing that we're seeing is Western companies try to reduce de-risk their supply chains, reduce their dependency on China. This is very easily said, very, very hard to do. Because even if you move manufacturing to India or Vietnam, which are both benefiting from people moving production of things away from China, in many cases they still rely on components or raw materials that are produced in China. And to have a completely de-Chinified supply chain is extremely difficult and will take years. And may take even longer than that, may not be possible for some things. One of the reasons it's so difficult is if you look at things like raw materials like lithium, an enormous amount of lithium is processed in China. And so that lithium that then goes into electric cars and smartphones and all the rest of it. If you want to have a supply chain that doesn't depend on China, you don't just need to get your own supply of lithium, and there's lithium all over the place, but you also need to be able to process that lithium and have your battery factories and all the rest of it completely independent of China. And that's very difficult to do. But that brings us to the next trend, which is this idea that these materials that we need for the green energy transition, they are a different set of resources to the fossil fuels that we were used to depending on, and they're also in different places. So this is redrawing the energy map, the energy resources map, And so, we're used to thinking that oil and gas, well, you find a lot of that in the Middle East. And so that has given the Middle East a great deal of prominence, which, 50 years since the oil shock and so forth. But now we're thinking about a different set of resources, things like lithium, nickel, copper, and they're in a different set of countries. And a lot of those countries are countries in the global south that are not on one side or the other of this new Cold War. And so this is one of the many factors, these middle powers, sometimes called the global middle ground, they have much more influence than they used to in this multipolar world where we suddenly want a different set of resources. And some of the countries are quite unexpected. So Indonesia and New Caledonia, for example, are big suppliers of nickel. I think most people are aware that Chile is a big supplier of lithium, but there are quite a few other countries that you don't think of when you think of lithium. So, for example, Zimbabwe is a large producer of lithium. Iran seems to have just found a big deposit, and there also seems to have just been a big discovery of a lithium deposit in the continental United States, which is very interesting if true. So it's not just that the resources are in different places and the map has changed for that reason. It's that the map itself is also in flux right now because new discoveries are being made all the time. One of the things we may see in 2024 is the first attempts at mining the seabed, where you can get valuable materials like manganese. So again, that would be a new phenomenon. And then another thing that complicates all of this is that technology itself is advancing. So it may be that we know how to make car batteries without cobalt, but it may be that it's possible to make quite good batteries without lithium. It may be that sodium batteries will come to the fore in the next few years. And if that happened, then, well, sodium is much more abundant than lithium. So I think we will become increasingly aware in 2024 of the way that this map is shifting and what the implications are for supply chains, for global trade, and for geopolitics, because suddenly we need to be friends with places that have a different set of resources. Looking at economics more broadly, the biggest thing we got wrong in our predictions for 2023 was we were too pessimistic about Western economies. So we predicted recessions in the US, Europe, and Britain as being very likely. And of course, the US economy has been unexpectedly strong in 2023. And the European economy was not as hard hit by the withdrawal of Russian gas as expected, because the winter was quite mild a year ago. Germany did have a recession. It was the most dependent on Russian gas, but the rest of the EU managed to avoid one. So there's the old economics joke that economists have successfully predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. And this is because, economists are always predicting recessions, and if you predict one, there'll always be one eventually. So the timing matters, and we were wrong when we said that there would be these recessions in 2023. It looks like the US is going to avoid one altogether. That seems to be the most likely outcome for 2024, a soft landing. So actually getting rid of inflation or bringing it down a lot without causing a recession. The EU and Britain, by contrast, are going to be bumping along at very close to zero growth and may go into a recession. But even if the recessions are avoided, I think for everybody, we are looking at the world being in a period of lower growth with higher inflation and higher interest rates than we've been used to for a decade or more. So this really is a very different regime. And the other place to keep a close eye on, of course, is China. Its unexpected reopening and overnight, abolition of its zero COVID policy has led to this reopening of the economy, but it hasn't performed anything like as well as the government would like it to. And the risk there is of a sort of Japan scenario, Japanification. If you look at what happened in Japan in the 1990s, it went into this prolonged period of low growth and deflation. And that is a possibility for China. The economic remedy for this is well known. It's stimulus, and it's sort of encouraging consumer spending. But China's policymakers seem to be sort of ideologically opposed to that. They're happy to prop up the property sector and things like that. But the sort of direct stimulus to consumers that we saw from the US during the pandemic, for example, that's the kind of thing that China seems very, very reluctant to do. So we should all keep an eye on that, because that's one of the big economic unknowns for 2024. One of the things we talked about a lot this year has been AI, and I think in 2024, artificial intelligence will get real in 2 ways in particular. I think companies that have been experimenting with the technology will start to deploy it more widely, and we'll see more products that include AI, some of which will work unexpectedly well and some of which will fail in unexpected ways. And that brings us to the second way that I think AI is going to sort of get real, which is that regulators are going to actually start regulating it. And there's been a lot of talk about that this year, but we're going to get the first actual rules being applied. China's started to do this. The EU is hoping to get its AI regulations, or at least the first stage of them, in place in the first half of next year. And I think quite a lot of the debate about the regulation of AI during 2023 has been a bit silly. There's been a lot of focus on existential risks and killer robots and all this sort of thing. And I think actually the bigger danger, I think all of the risk of that is massively overstated. And certainly there is no chance of killer robots showing up in 2024. But I think where there is a risk and where regulators should be focusing, and certainly the European regulations are focusing, is on the danger that existing AI systems, not some mythical future ones, but existing ones that are deployed now, can produce results that demonstrate bias or discrimination. And that's the sort of area where I think regulators should rightly be focusing. And I think a lot of the talk about the killer robots and the existential risks to some extent has been a distraction by some of the big tech companies, which would prefer to talk about possible risks in the future in order to hamper and to divert attention away from actual risks that exist now. But I think also part of it is a sort of dark hype. I'm reminded of what was said about Robert Oppenheimer, somebody we've all become very familiar with this year because of the movie. But Oppenheimer in later life felt guilty for his involvement in creation of nuclear weapons. And somebody else, John von Neumann, said of him, some people profess guilt to claim credit for the sin. In other words, when Oppenheimer is saying, oh, I apologize for creating this amazing world-changing technology, when people apologize for creating an awesomely powerful technology, they're not really apologizing, they're really boasting. And I think that's what's happening with a lot of the tech bros here. By talking up the potential future risks of this technology, they're really talking up its awesome power, by extension, their own awesomeness. But it's also a sort of dark hype. As one AI scientist has referred to it. Elon Musk is warning you of the danger of killer robots on the one hand, but he's trying to sell you a self-driving car on the other. So talking up the power of this technology is not necessarily a bad idea from his perspective. The other big concern that I think people have, where the evidence, well, we'll see what evidence we get in 2024, but that people have always been worried about the impact of all of this on jobs. And the evidence so far is that AI and robots are not taking jobs. OECD employment is at absolutely unprecedented levels, multi-decade highs, and unemployment is at multi-decade lows. So if the robots are taking the jobs, I'm not quite sure whose jobs they're taking. Instead, what seems to be happening is that this technology can boost productivity. And this is most visible in computer programming, in software engineering. And there was a lovely natural experiment earlier this year where Italy it blocked ChatGPT for a week. And during that week, the productivity of Italian programmers, measured by the amount of code they were checking into GitHub, which is an online code repository, fell by half. So I think a lot of coders are using ChatGPT or other similar products to get an unexpected performance boost. I'm personally doing that myself, and I know other people who are. And I think it's an extraordinary invisible productivity boost, and I'm going to be looking for this coming through in the productivity figures for entire economies in 2024. I think it's possible we'll start to be able to see that at a larger scale. But I've heard so many examples of this, and it's particularly what's interesting about this is that both for people who work in call centers, for programmers, and for consultants, when they've done studies on the productivity impact of these technologies, what they found is that the use of AI assistants boosts the performance of the middling performers, the sort of mediocre programmers like me. It doesn't really help people who are the best in the field at the top of the distribution, but the people at the bottom and in the middle get a real boost. So that's really interesting because that suggests that AI is a technology that has the potential to reduce inequality rather than increase it. So again, there's some very preliminary work on this, but the results are extremely intriguing and very provocative. So I will be looking closely for more evidence on that front in 2024. Finally, is there some thing that will bring everyone together in this increasingly fractious and disorderly world? Well, there are some candidates in 2024. One is the Paris Olympics, which is, even jaded cynics like me often find it, surprisingly moving to see, all the athletes in a particular field competing from around the world to see who's best. However, I think, as with previous Olympics, we are likely to see a lot of political arguments about how and whether athletes from Russia and Belarus should be allowed to compete and under what sort of flag and all the rest of it. So I'm afraid that's already turning into a political football. What about the return to the moon? So there's going to be, as due to be an American mission to the moon in November of 2024. It may get pushed into 2025, but so far it's scheduled for November 2024. It wouldn't be landing on the moon; it would just be going around the back of the moon and then coming back again to test out all of the spacecraft and so on. And this would be the mission involving the first black man, the first woman, and the first non-American to leave Earth orbit. So surely that would again be a cause for celebration. But I think once again this is very likely to be politicized, because here we are in another Cold War, and we've got another American space program, and as in the first Cold War, the space program was very much a reminder, a demonstration by America of its technological superiority. And I think many people will be reading this moonshot as in a very similar light. So unfortunately, I'm not persuaded that that's going to lead to an outburst of global unity either. The other area that some of my colleagues at The Economist are very keen on is cricket. And the men's 2020 World Cup for cricket is coming to the US in 2023. It's going to be in 2024. It's going to be jointly hosted by the West Indies and the US. And so cricket buffs are hoping that this will be the point at which America catches the cricketing bug. But I think they could be on a bit of a sticky wicket. I think they could be caught out. And I fear that anyone looking for a moment of global unity in 2024 is likely to be stumped, as the cricketers say. So you can read more about all of these trends on our website at this address, in our app if you're a subscriber, in the various print editions of The World Ahead. And I wish you all the very best of luck in navigating the ups and downs of the coming year. Thanks very much for listening, and let's do some Q&A.
Tom, thanks so much. It's always such a fun time to listen to your presentation. Before we take some of the Q&A, I have to do a shout out for a young man who turned 14 in September. His name is Beckett Potter, and he asked his parents, they said, "What do you want for your birthday?" And of course he said, "I'd like a subscription to The Economist." So I want to give Beckett the opportunity to ask the first question. So here it is. What are your thoughts on the new advancements in nuclear fusion this year, and whether it will affect the future of clean energy, especially in Europe, where the shift to renewables has been faster than in the United States?
Yeah, it's interesting how much interest there suddenly is in fusion. So fusion has always been the technology of the future. It's always been 50 years away, forever. But now we've got a lot. What's really interesting is we've got a lot of startups in this field, and we've got a lot of venture capital money going into this, and that's always a sign that something might be about to happen. So I'm more optimistic than I was, but I think we need to. There's a sort of moral hazard here. We can't say, well, we can go a bit more slowly on decarbonizing everything else, because if fusion works, that'll save us. We can't assume it's going to work, so we still have to push ahead with decarbonizing our electricity grids in other ways, lots and lots of solar and wind. And Germany was obviously wrong to turn off its nuclear power stations. That was dumb. They shouldn't have done that. We need more nuclear fission as well, and so we're seeing something of a renaissance there. But yes, obviously I would love it if fusion came along and made energy limitless and free. To be honest though, at the rate at which solar is falling in price, we are going to have very, very cheap solar energy all over the place. And we're going to need to massively overbuild solar. And solar and wind, you have to overbuild both of them so that you can account for cloudy days and days when it's not windy. And that means that when you have that excess capacity, you can use it to do things like make hydrogen and then use that in industrial processes and so on. So we need to be doing more of all of that. I share his optimism that fusion will come through, but we can't rely on it. So we have to assume the worst, and then if we're pleasantly surprised that it starts working, that would be great. But I suppose more generally, I am in the camp of people who thinks that the way this problem gets solved is through technological innovation going faster than expected, because the political process to fix climate change is definitely going slowly, more slowly than expected, and more slowly than it needs to fix the problem. So I think it's more likely that the technologists save us than the politicians. But again, we can't bank on it, so we all have to do what we can.
So Becca just pointed out to me in a text that the demographic age of the Economist reader is actually lower because he just turned 12. So there we go.
Ah, brilliant. Even better. That's what we want. That's what we want.
So as always, we get this question, and it comes this year from Paula Margolis. Tell us about what you got right and wrong in 2023.
Right. So the other piece I have to write every year, apart from my letter summarizing what's coming up in the top 10, is I also have to write a piece called How We Did and What We Got Right and Wrong. So the main thing we got wrong was, as I said, the economic stuff about Western economies, which turned out to be more resilient than we expected. Other things we got wrong, we didn't see Hamas's attacks coming. Everyone was taken by surprise by that. We did actually write about the state of the Abraham Accords, and we said that Saudi Arabia looked like it was, next in the queue, but that this was contingent on everybody continuing to turn a blind eye to the plight of the Palestinians, and that is exactly what Hamas was objecting to, which is that essentially everyone was saying, if we ignore what's happening in the Palestinian territories, maybe it will all just go away. So I sort of give us half a point on that one. Other things other things we generally the election outcomes and things we got right. I mean, we wanted Erdogan to lose in Turkey, and we wanted Peter Obi to win in Nigeria, and neither of those things happened, which is what we predicted, but not what we wanted. So I think we did reasonably okay. We said that the war in Ukraine would probably be a grinding stalemate. We said that US politics would probably settle into a Biden-Trump rematch, and those things happened. So I think the big one that we got it wrong on was the economy.
So what about this super forecast? And that's where you draw on Good Judgment, this forecasting firm.
Yeah.
Because they have a very interesting view of what may happen in the US presidential election.
Well, they've just done the 1 in 3 chance comes from them, and I graded their forecast for last year, and they got basically 8 out of 8 last year. So they're pretty good on this. Yeah, they think it's most likely that assuming it's Biden, they're saying it's most likely that the Democratic nominee wins next year, but it's very close. So they have basically a 2-to-1 chance there, and I think their most recent forecasts are more like 55 to 45. So it's closer to a coin toss. But generally, they are very good, and we're very happy to have an association with them.
So who are they?
So they are essentially a chap called Philip Tetlock at University of Pennsylvania came up with a method, the super forecasting method. It's based on an older method invented in the 1950s by the Rand Corporation called Delphi. And he sort of refined it and added a bunch of sort of modern improvements to it. And the intelligence community in America held a competition about 10 years ago to see who was the best at geopolitical forecasting. And they had teams from different universities, from think tanks, from consultancies, and they had the super forecasters. And the super forecasters won by a huge margin. And so everyone thought, well, it might have been a fluke. So they did it again the next year, and the super forecasters won again by a huge margin. So they stopped having the competition, and the super forecasters now are partly funded, I think, by people like the US State Department and so on. So they are the people who have shown that their approach, which is to it's very interesting because they think that forecasting can be taught, and they think there are some people who are sort of good at it. What's interesting is the consistent finding is that that experts in a given field are not the people you should ask, because when someone devotes their entire life to a specific industry or topic or something like that, they tend to overestimate how big the impact of that field will be, whether positively or negatively, and so they tend to overstate things. And you can see this very, very clearly in the results. What you want are generalists who can pick things up quickly, assess information impartially, and are aware of their own cognitive biases. And you can learn to become more aware of your cognitive biases. And that's what the super forecasters are. They're people from all walks of life. Journalists turn out to have quite a similar skill set. So you essentially want generalists who can learn quickly. and are sort of good at assessing the plausibility of evidence. But that's who the super forecasters are, and we're very pleased to have an association with them and have done for many years.
Well, since we're so interested, I think most of the people on this call, let me just read what they said. What will be the result of the United States presidential election 2024? Democratic nominee wins the electoral and popular vote, 63%, they said, wins the electoral vote, but not the popular vote, 2%. Looking at the Republican nominee, wins the electoral and popular votes, 10%, wins the electoral vote, but not the popular vote, 25%. So very, very
Well,
interesting.
that's just a reflection of the strangeness. I mean, this is part of the reason why America is classified as a flawed democracy, because the electoral college system, which we all know why it's there for historical reasons, but what it means is that Republicans tend to win when they win, they tend to win in the electoral college, but they lose the popular vote. And when Democrats win, they tend to win in they win the popular vote and they win in the electoral college. So so that's the chances of a Democrat winning the popular vote but not winning in the it's just to do with the way that the electoral college essentially is a bias towards rural constituencies. So that's why you get. But the main thing is if you add up the overall chances of Democrats winning versus the overall chances of Republicans winning, you basically get 66-33. So that's why we say it's a 1 in 3. And as I say, I think it's narrowed to sort of 55-45 since we went to press.
Okay, so here's a fun question from Greg Gosick. If the Economist had a person of the year, who would you highlight as being the most significant individual of 2023? Would it be Taylor Swift? Like Time Magazine.
Yes. No, that's exactly. Very good. Obviously, she's had a great year. That's a very good question, and I'm surprised no one has asked me that yet. But they haven't, so I haven't got an answer. Who's an obvious person? Yeah, I don't.
Well, I'll let you think about it for a minute. We'll come back to
okay.
it. Here's a question from Ray Termini in Dallas. Considering the low ratings of Biden and the continued support of President Trump, could the U.S. 2024 election really be based more on voter dissatisfaction, as in 2016, rather than personalities, as in 2020?
Yes, I think that's very plausible, and I think actually either of them could could drop out for health reasons or whatever. And I think if that happened, if Donald Trump was had to drop out either for health reasons or for legal reasons, that would, I think, give the Democrats the opportunity to parachute in a younger candidate. And I think if you look at the polls, both supporters of both parties would like somebody else, right? The only people who want this rematch are the two guys themselves, as far as I can tell. And so I think and it really is, it's extraordinary. Look at this from outside the US, what a gerontocracy you have. You have such incredibly old people. And why is that? Again, it's part of the reason why America is a flawed democracy. It's because you have gerrymandering. So you have people who cannot lose their seats. And so they are in power forever. And the only possible way they can lose is if somebody more extreme from their own party primaries them. But essentially they have, a perfectly, someone like Matt Gaetz, he's in a perfectly safe seat, right? So of course he's crazy and just does. I mean, what are the consequences of him being crazy? There aren't any. And so the rest of the world sort of looks at this and says, why do you let the politicians draw the boundaries of their own electoral districts? This is crazy. And California has stepped back from this and introduced a non-partisan electoral commission and so on. But this is just not how it works in most of the world. Well, it is. It's how it works in places where elections get rigged all the time. But America is sort of sliding towards all of this electoral well, it's got electoral dysfunction, but in large part because of the mechanics of its electoral system, and that's one of the things that.
So let me ask you this: do you see a path for no labels or a third-party candidate?
I'm not sure what a path is. I don't see a path for them winning. I see a path for a third-party candidate who could very easily affect the election either way, depending on who they take votes away from. And various people are talked about here. So Joe Manchin and Liz Cheney and so on. And opinion varies on exactly who would win or lose. RFK, it looks like actually he would take more votes away from Trump. So Republicans seem to be, they talked him up, and they wanted him to be on all the TV shows, and now they're like, no, stop talking about him. And you can see why. So yeah, I think we've seen this in so many elections, right, with Jill Stein and et cetera,
Ross Perot, of course, years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So So I think there could be a third party candidate, and it could affect things either way. And this is just all what makes 2024 so unpredictable. And the other interesting indicator I heard from somebody recently was that apparently American property insurers are they are increasingly reluctant to provide coverage for buildings for damage caused by riots and public disorder. And so that suggests that insurance companies think there is a growing chance of widespread social disorder and public disorder. And I'm not surprised, because that's what I would expect as well. If Trump doesn't win, if he wins outright, then then maybe there won't be, well, no, there'd probably be protests in the other direction then. But if he doesn't win, then he's going to try all his tricks and things again. And so I think what worries me personally about this is that I'm going to have to go to press sometime in the beginning of November, and I suspect we won't know what the result of the election is, because I think we're going to have chaos for the last, we're going to have weeks of chaos at the end of 2024. So I hope that's one prediction where I'm completely wrong.
Well, my friend, you're often right on your forecast. I hope on this one you're not. We have 2 or 3 questions from different members of our audience asking you to elaborate more on what it means about the United States being more active in a multipolar world, or are we in a unipolar world, and what does it mean going forward? And I think I'd like you to weave into that a little bit more about how the United States foreign policy could change under a Trump administration.
Yes. So it looks like the Republicans are taking a sort of isolationist turn. And we've seen this before in US history, of course, between the First and Second World Wars. But that would be the big change, that that Trump seems not to be interested in. I mean, famously, when he was president, he asked whether Japan and South Korea were paying America for protection as its security guarantor in the Pacific, and he couldn't understand why they literally weren't paying cash to America, like a mob boss is extorting people to not go and smash up their shop. So so he couldn't understand. So he's very transactional about this, and I think it's really the big question is what he would do on Taiwan, because Republicans talk about being tough on China. It's not quite sure what they mean about that, but also you can imagine Trump saying, well, why should we put American lives on the line to defend some tiddly widdly little island on the other side of the world that I've never heard of? And you can totally imagine him doing that. So it's really, really unpredictable. He could go either way on that. On Israel, it's hard to imagine him pushing any pressure on Israel. He'd probably just give them a carte blanche to do whatever they like. So and then clearly he wants to pull the plug on Ukraine, because he's got a very long beef with Zelensky, and the Republicans do generally, because they blame Zelensky and the perfect phone call for the first impeachment. So so yeah, you can imagine America turning very much inward, and that causing problems for the rest of the world, because you've suddenly got the withdrawal of the security guarantees and this big important ally. So that's I think is and that's then an opportunity for for other powers like Iran and China and Russia to do whatever they want, and they're relishing the prospect, frankly.
What do you think about the BRICS? And we have just a minute left, but I found it interesting and was not remembering or aware that the next meeting is going to be next October in Russia.
I know they're also going to add new members to the BRICS next year. The thing about the BRICS is they're a weird club, because the only thing they have in common is that they dislike the rules-based international order, sort of as imposed after the Second World War. So they agree on that, but they disagree on almost everything else. Some of them are authoritarian, some of them are democracies. They can't agree on UN reform. They can't agree on anything. And they tried to have an investment fund. They tried to have a sort of equivalent of an Asian Development Bank, and it all went nowhere. So the problem is, this is what happened in the French Revolution. Everyone could agree with what they didn't want. They didn't want the king, and once they got rid of the king, they couldn't agree on what they wanted, and the result was chaos. So the thing about the BRICS is that they're essentially bound together by a single grievance. And that's a recipe for not really having any influence and not being able to get anything done. Whereas, the G7 are bound together, yes, by the fact that they're rich countries, but they're all rich liberal democracies that essentially want to take the world in the same direction. And you can't say the same for the BRICS. So that's accordingly, the BRICS is getting bigger, and the bigger it gets, I think, that doesn't mean it's going to get any more relevant. It's very, very hard to see a sort of coherent set of policy demands coming from a club with such diverse members.
Well, as always, as you pointed out, in the world ahead, there's going to be a lot for us to watch, a lot for us to read about in your wonderful
Absolutely.
newspaper. So, as always, thanks, Tom, for being with us. And to all of you who are in our audience today, happy holidays, and we'll see you again soon.